Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the sleep paralysis demon. Our story begins in a house tucked away at the edge of a sleeping town, where the trees have begun their slow, golden surrender to the arrival of autumn. The year is unimportant, but the atmosphere is everything. Outside, the air has turned crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the smoky breath of distant fireplaces. A man named Elias lives here, in a structure built of old cedar and heavy stone. It is a house that breathes with the wind, its floorboards settling into a rhythmic creak that usually provides a comforting soundtrack to his solitude. On this particular night, the moon is a thin, pale sliver hanging over the naked branches of the oaks. Elias has spent the evening reading by the low orange glow of a single lamp, the pages of his book feeling soft and worn between his fingers. As the clock on the mantel strikes 11, he feels the familiar, heavy pull of exhaustion. He climbs the stairs, his footsteps muffled by a thick wool runner, and enters a bedroom that smells faintly of lavender and old paper. He slides beneath the heavy down comforter, the cool linen sheets embracing him as he closes his eyes, unaware that the boundary between the waking world and the realm of the unseen is beginning to thin. The transition into sleep is usually a seamless bridge, a gentle fading of the light until nothing remains but the quiet pulse of the subconscious. For Elias, the first hour of rest is deep and undisturbed. He dreams of vast, open fields where the wind moves through the grass like a silent tide. But as the clock downstairs ticks toward 3 a.m, something shifts in the molecular stillness of the room. The temperature seems to drop by a fraction of a degree, the kind of chill that bypasses the skin and settles directly into the marrow. In his sleep, Elias feels a sudden, sharp clarity. It is as if a curtain has been ripped open, exposing his mind to the room while his body remains anchored in the depths of a heavy, chemical slumber. He opens his eyes, or at least, he believes he does. The room looks exactly as it should. The moonlight casts long, distorted shadows across the ceiling, and the dust motes dance in the silver beams like tiny, suspended ghosts. He can see the silhouette of his dresser and the way his coat hangs on the back of the chair. But when he tries to roll onto his side to adjust the pillow, he finds that he is entirely unresponsive. His limbs feel as though they have been cast in solid lead, fixed to the mattress by an invisible, absolute force. This is the state known to science as rapid eye movement atonia. It is a biological safety switch, a mechanism designed to keep the body from acting out the frantic movements of our dreams. Usually, this paralysis dissolves the moment we stir, but for Elias, the switch is stuck. He is a prisoner within his own skin. He tries to wiggle a toe, to twitch a finger, to make any small gesture that might break the spell, but the connection between his brain and his muscles has been severed. The silence of the house, once so peaceful, now feels predatory. Every small sound is magnified. He hears the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway, each second sounding like a heavy hammer falling on an anvil. His breathing is shallow, restricted by a mounting tension that he cannot explain. He wants to call out, to shout for help, but his throat is a dry, narrow corridor that refuses to let the air pass. He can feel the panic rising in his chest, a hot, frantic bird trapped behind his ribs, yet his face remains a mask of perfect, terrifying calm. He is wide awake, staring into the dark, and that is when the wait arrives. At first, it is subtle. It feels like the air itself has become more viscous, pressing down on him with the weight of 100 blankets. But slowly, the pressure localizes. It gathers on the center of his chest, a heavy, cold density that makes every inhalation an agonizing struggle. In the folklore of the old world, they called this the Mara, or the Old Hag. It is the sensation of a malevolent presence sitting atop the dreamer, stealing the very breath from their lungs. Elias feels his ribcage groan under the invisible burden. He can almost feel the texture of it, something rough and ancient, pressing the life out of him. His eyes dart around the room, the only part of him still free to move, searching for the source of this suffocating gravity. The shadows in the corner of the room begin to thicken, losing their amorphous shapes and coiling into something more deliberate. There, in the space between the wardrobe and the door, a figure begins to manifest. It is taller than a man, a column of obsidian darkness that seems to absorb the very light of the moon. It has no face, no eyes to meet his own, yet Elias knows with a bone-deep certainty that it is looking directly at him. It stands perfectly still, a monolith of malice waiting for the moment his spirit breaks. The figure does not move, yet it seems to grow closer with every thud of Elias' heart. The room feels smaller now, the walls leaning inward as if to witness the encounter. He tries once more to scream, a silent, internal roar that goes nowhere. He wonders if this is how life ends, in a quiet bedroom in autumn, pinned beneath the weight of a shadow. The smell in the room changes, shifting from the scent of lavender to something metallic and sharp, like the ozone before a storm or the smell of cold iron. He can hear a low, vibrating hum now, a sound that vibrates in his teeth and makes his vision swim. It is the sound of the void, a frequency that shouldn't exist in a place of rest. The shadow man takes a single, gliding step forward. It has no feet to touch the floorboards, no weight to make them creak, yet the air ripples around it like heat over asphalt. Elias watches as the darkness reaches out, a long, spindly arm of shadow extending toward the bed. The weight on his chest doubles, the pressure so intense now that his vision begins to darken at the edges. He is drowning in the air, his heart racing at 100 beats per minute, while his body remains a statue of marble and fear. Just as the shadow's fingers seem poised to brush against his forehead, the tension reaches its breaking point. With a sudden, violent jolt, the paralysis snaps. Elias gasps, a jagged, desperate sound that shatters the silence of the room. He sits up abruptly, his chest heaving as he gulps down the cool, night air. His hands are trembling as he reaches for the bedside lamp, fumbling with the switch until the room is flooded with warm, yellow light. He is alone. The corner is empty. The wardrobe stands silent, and the shadows have retreated to their natural, harmless places. He checks the clock. Only 4 minutes have passed since he first felt the shift, yet it feels as though he has lived through an entire lifetime of terror. He wipes the cold sweat from his brow, his fingers tracing the indentation on his chest where the weight had been so tangible. Outside, a single leaf scratches against the window pane, a dry, rhythmic sound that reminds him that the world is still there, still turning. But as he lies back down, his heart slowly finding its rhythm again, he cannot shake the feeling that the shadow is still there, just on the other side of the light, waiting for the next time he closes his eyes to sleep. The world rushed back in a violent, cold wave. Elias sat up, his lungs burning as if he had been held underwater for several minutes. The silence of his room was absolute, yet it felt heavy, vibrating with the echoes of a scream that had never left his throat. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a rhythmic thumping that seemed too loud for the stillness of 3 in the morning. He looked at his hands, watching them tremble in the pale, blue light filtering through the window blinds. They were his hands again. He could move his fingers, clench his fists, and feel the friction of the cotton sheets. The air in the room was thin and carried the metallic tang of fear. He remained motionless for a long time, listening to the house settle, convinced that any small creak of the floorboards was the shadow returning to claim the space beside his bed. Eventually, the primal urge to understand began to override the paralysis of terror. Elias reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, to flick the switch of the bedside lamp. The amber glow flooded the room, peeling back the layers of darkness that had felt so solid only moments before. He scanned the corners of the ceiling, the gap behind the door, and the pile of laundry on the chair that had transformed into a crouching figure during his ordeal. There was nothing. The room was exactly as he had left it when he first drifted off. He paced the floor, his bare feet meeting the cold hardwood, trying to ground himself in the physical reality of his surroundings. He told himself it was just a nightmare, a particularly vivid manifestation of the stress he had been carrying from work. But the sensation of those long, spindly fingers remained like a phantom burn, a lingering chill. Sleep was now an impossible prospect. Elias sat at his small desk, the soft hum of his laptop providing a thin veil of comfort against the silence. He began to type, his fingers still stiff, searching for anything that could explain the impossible. He found the term almost immediately: sleep paralysis. As he read the words on the glowing screen, a wave of clinical relief washed over him. The articles spoke of rapid eye movement atonia, a natural biological process where the brain paralyzes the body's muscles to prevent a person from acting out their dreams. It was a safeguard, a primitive mechanism designed for protection. Sometimes, the research explained, the brain wakes up before the atonia has fully worn off. The person finds themselves in a bridge between worlds, conscious of their room, but trapped in the dream's physical lockdown. Elias clung to these words, repeating the medical phrases like a protective mantra. The research went deeper, into the realm of the amygdala. This small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons in the brain is responsible for the fight or flight response. During an episode of sleep paralysis, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. Because the body cannot move to escape a perceived threat, the brain enters a state of high-alert panic. To make sense of this intense fear, the mind projects an intruder into the visual field: a shadow, a demon, or a malevolent presence. It was all a trick of the wiring, a biological glitch. Elias felt a sense of superiority over his fear as he read about the hundreds of years of folklore that had attempted to explain this. People had spoken of the Old Hag in the British Isles, the mountain spirits in distant lands, and the crushing weight of the incubus. It was fascinating. He was simply one of the few who experienced this neurological mismatch. Yet, despite the abundance of scientific data, the atmosphere of his bedroom had been irrevocably altered. He found himself looking at his bed not as a place of rest, but as a site of potential ambush. The rational part of his mind accepted the chemical explanation, but his lizard brain remained on high alert. He noticed how the shadows cast by his curtains seemed to stretch and pull toward him. He began to obsess over his sleep hygiene, reading that sleeping on one's back was a primary trigger for these episodes. He carefully rearranged his pillows, building a fortress to ensure he would remain on his side throughout the night. He turned off the main lights, but kept the closet door cracked, the small bulb inside casting a sliver of safety across the floor. He was preparing for a battle he wasn't entirely sure was over, his mind constantly replaying the shadow's touch. As the sun finally began to bleed through the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, Elias felt the true weight of the lingering chill. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was a psychological shift. The daylight brought a temporary reprieve, but the mundane tasks of his day were haunted by a new, creeping hypervigilance. Every time he blinked, he expected to see a dark figure in the periphery of his vision. He drank 3 cups of coffee, hoping the caffeine would keep the borders of sleep far away, yet the exhaustion only made his thoughts more erratic. He was experiencing what the journals called sleep dread, a persistent anxiety about the return of nightfall. The once clear line between the waking world and the world of shadows had been blurred. He wasn't just tired, he was waiting. He was waiting for the sun to set. The light that Elias watched as it climbed over the horizon was the same sun that once illuminated the mud brick walls of Uruk and the marble columns of Athens. While he felt like a lone survivor of a unique terror, he was merely one link in a chain of human experience that stretches back through the dust of 4 millennia. To understand the shadow that sat upon his chest, we must travel back to the cradle of civilization, to a time when the boundary between the physical world and the spirit realm was as thin as a veil of silk in a summer breeze. Imagine the nights in ancient Mesopotamia, where the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the distant howl of jackals. There, on clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script nearly 4,000 years ago, we find the first whispers of the entities that steal the breath. They did not call it a sleep disorder then. They called it a visitation. In the flickering orange glow of oil lamps, the Sumerians spoke of the Lilitu. These were not mere figments of a tired mind, but class of demons that lived within the storms and the shadows. The Lilitu and her more specialized daughter, the Ardent Lily, were said to be the spirits of those who died young, never having known the touch of a spouse or the joy of a child. Because of this unfulfilled life, they were believed to wander the night in search of companionship, finding it in the bedrooms of the living. A man would lie down in his reed hut, the weight of a long day in the fields pulling him into a deep slumber, only to find himself suddenly pinned to his mat. He could see her, a pale, ethereal figure with the wings of a bird and the talons of a predator, resting her weight upon his ribcage. He would try to cry out to his gods, but his throat would be dry, his tongue heavy like lead, as she drained the very essence of his life through his paralyzed breath. The Assyrians later whispered of the Alu, a demon that was perhaps even more terrifying because it often lacked a face. It was described as a formless, leathery envelope that would wrap itself around a sleeper. Imagine the sensation of being swallowed by a shadow, the air growing cold and thin as the Alu descends. There are no eyes to plead with, no mouth to bargain with. There is only the crushing pressure of the unseen. These ancient people did not have the luxury of neurological explanations. They didn't know about rapid eye movement or the chemical suppression of muscle tone. To them, the paralysis was a literal intrusion. They buried incantation bowls upside down beneath their floors, inscribed with holy verses intended to trap these night-wandering spirits. They lived in a world where the night was a predator, and sleep was a gamble one took every time the sun dipped below the desert sands. Moving westward across the Mediterranean, the Greeks developed their own vocabulary for this midnight suffocator. They called it the Ephialtes. The word itself translates to one who leaps upon. In the olive-scented nights of early Greece, the Ephialtes was seen as a spirit or a minor deity that sought to oppress the dreamer. It was not just a nightmare. It was a physical act of aggression. The physician Themison of Laodicea, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, gave it a name that translates to the throttler or the choker. He observed patients who spoke of a heavy weight, a sense of being strangled by an invisible hand. Even then, the descriptions were identical to those we hear today. The person is awake, yet they are a prisoner within their own skin. The air in the room becomes stagnant, and the heart hammers against the ribs like a trapped bird, yet the limbs remain as still as the statues in a temple courtyard. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the famous physician Galen began to push back against the supernatural, though even his scientific mind struggled to fully grasp the phenomenon. He believed that these night terrors were caused by gastric disturbances, vapors rising from a heavy stomach to cloud the brain. Yet, despite his clinical approach, the people still feared the god Pan. They believed that Pan, the wild god of the woods, would sometimes emerge from the shadows to sit upon the chests of those who dared to sleep in his sacred groves. This was the origin of the word panic. It was the sudden, heart-stopping realization that you are not alone in the dark, and that the thing standing over you is not of this world. The Greeks would wear amulets of iron or stone, hoping the cold weight of the charm would counteract the crushing weight of the spirit. It is fascinating to think that while our civilizations have risen and fallen, while we have moved from clay tablets to digital screens, the experience itself has remained unchanged. The Lilitu of Mesopotamia and the Ephialtes of Greece are the same shadow that visited Elias in his modern bedroom. These ancient accounts provide a bridge across time, a reminder that our ancestors stood in the same dark rooms, felt the same phantom pressure, and asked the same desperate questions. They saw demons where we see neurons, but the terror was identical. As we leave the ancient world behind, the shadow does not disappear. It only changes its mask, preparing to haunt the monasteries of the Middle Ages and the cottages of the Old World. The breath stealer is patient. It has been watching us sleep for thousands of years, waiting for the moment when our eyes open, but our bodies remain under its heavy, ancient spell. The wind across the North Atlantic carries a particular kind of weight. It is a cold, salt-laden breath that rattles the windowpanes of Newfoundland and Labrador, a place where the landscape is as rugged as the history is deep. Here, the ocean does not merely provide a living. It shapes the very dreams of those who dwell along its jagged cliffs. In the small outports and the fog-shrouded harbor towns, stories are not just entertainment. They are a form of maps, guiding the living through the mysteries of the unseen world. As the sun dips below the horizon and the houses grow quiet, a different kind of visitor prepares to make her rounds. In this part of the world, she is known as the Old Hag. She is a cultural constant, a figure whispered about for generations, as real to the local imagination as the rocky soil beneath their feet. Imagine yourself lying in a narrow bed in one of those coastal homes. The fire in the hearth has died down to a few glowing embers, and the only sound is the rhythmic groan of the floorboards as the house settles into the night. You are drifting, suspended in that soft, hazy space between wakefulness and deep slumber. Your breathing slows, your limbs grow heavy, and the world begins to dissolve. But then, a sudden change in the atmosphere pulls you back. The air in the room feels thicker, more oppressive. You try to shift your weight, to roll onto your side, but your body refuses to respond. It is as if your muscles have been turned to lead, pinned down by an invisible force. You are fully awake now, your mind racing, yet you are a prisoner within your own skin. In the corner of your eye, a shadow begins to detach itself from the darkness. It moves with a slow, deliberate creeping, an intentionality that chills your blood. This is the moment the people of Newfoundland call being hagged. The figure that emerges is often described as an ancient woman, her face a roadmap of deep wrinkles and withered skin. Her hair is long, matted, and white like the sea foam on a stormy day. She does not walk. She glides or slithers, her movements reminiscent of something ancient and predatory. As she nears the bed, you see her eyes, unrelenting, gleaming with a malevolence that feels centuries old. She has a twisted, toothless grin, or perhaps a mouth full of yellowed, sharp teeth that catch the faint light of the moon. The terror reaches its peak when she finally makes contact. She does not merely stand by the bedside. In the folklore of the North, the old hag climbs onto the bed and settles her weight directly onto your chest. It is a crushing sensation, as if a great stone has been placed upon your lungs. Every breath becomes a monumental struggle, a shallow gasp for air that feels as though it will be your last. Some victims describe her bony hands reaching for their throat, her fingers cold as ice, or the sound of her rasping breath against their ear. She might whisper things, threats or nonsense words that sound like curses. You want to scream, to call out for help to whoever might be sleeping in the next room, but your throat is tight, and your voice is nothing more than a silent, internal plea. The phrase hag-ridden is not just a metaphor here. It is a clinical description of an ordeal. In the 1970s, a researcher named David Hufford traveled through these communities, documenting hundreds of these accounts. He found that for many Newfoundlanders, this was not a rare medical anomaly, but a shared cultural reality. In his seminal work, The Terror That Comes in the Night, he explored how these experiences were woven into the daily lives of the people. They didn't see it as a brain misfiring during rapid eye movement sleep. They saw it as a supernatural assault. They had names for it, rituals to explain it, and a profound respect for the shadow that visits in the dark. To be hag-ridden was to be exhausted, drained of vitality, as if the entity had literally ridden the sleeper through the night like a horse. Because the fear was so prevalent, the people developed an array of defenses, small rituals meant to guard the sanctuary of the bedroom. Some would tie a vibrant red ribbon to the bedpost, a splash of color to ward off the gray shadow. Others took more drastic measures, placing a sharp knife or a pair of open scissors beneath their pillow, believing that steel could cut through the hag's power. There were even tales of those who lashed a board with upward-pointing nails to their chest, a desperate attempt to wound the creature when she tried to sit upon them. One of the most curious remedies involved the power of a name. It was said that if someone else in the house heard the victim's muffled struggles, they could break the spell by calling the victim's name backwards. In that reversal, the logic of the supernatural world was unraveled, and the hag would vanish into the salt air from which she came. Beyond the small trinkets and the circles of salt, there existed a far more ancient understanding of the weight that descends in the deep, quiet hours of the night. In the frost-bitten landscapes of early Scandinavia and the Germanic reaches, this weight was not a nameless glitch of the mind, but a specific, cold-blooded presence known as the Mara. To the people of those long, dark winters, the night was not merely an absence of light, but a medium through which the Mara traveled. She was a spirit that did not walk upon the earth as humans do, but moved like a lingering fog, slipping between the gaps in the timber walls of a farmhouse. While the rituals of the bedroom offered a sense of control, the folklore suggested that the Mara was as inevitable as the winter wind itself. She was the architect of the first nightmares, a creature whose very name would eventually weave itself into the language we use for our darkest dreams. The word itself, Mara, carries a sound that is soft yet strangely oppressive. Linguists trace its roots back through Old Norse and Old English, eventually finding its origin in a Proto-Germanic term that means to crush, to press, or to rub away. It is a word that describes a physical violation of the body's space. In the ancient tongue, to have a nightmare was literally to be visited by the Mara. In Norwegian, the word for nightmare is merit, and in Danish, it is merit, both of which translate most literally to the mare ride. This was the belief that the entity did not just visit the sleeper, but mounted them, sitting upon the ribcage like a rider on a horse. The lungs would struggle beneath her weight, the breath becoming a thin, frantic thing as the ribs were slowly compressed by an invisible, relentless force that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second of the night. This concept of the ride was more than just a metaphor for the ancestors of the North. It was a terrifying reality that could, in their stories, lead to the threshold of death itself. The old Icelandic sagas tell the story of King Vanlandi, a ruler of Uppsala who fell victim to a Mara conjured by a vengeful sorceress. As the king lay down to rest, he felt a sudden, crushing lethality settle over him. His men rushed to his side to save him from the invisible assailant, but as they tried to lift the weight from his legs, the Mara simply shifted her focus to his head. And as they reached for his head, she pressed down upon his legs with such intensity that his life was snuffed out. This tale highlights the most terrifying aspect of the Mara. She is often unseen, felt only as a shifting gravity that moves across the body with a mind of its own, avoiding every attempt at intervention. The sensation of the Mara's arrival often begins with a subtle shift in the air of the room. It is a cooling of the temperature, a sudden stillness that feels as though the very oxygen has become dense and difficult to pull into the chest. This is what the elders referred to as the Mara's breath. It was said that as she leaned over the sleeper, her own breath was like a draft from a tomb, chilling the skin and freezing the muscles into a state of total helplessness. The victim might try to scream, but the Mara's breath would catch in their throat, turning the sound into a silent, hollow gasp. This interplay between the spirit and the sleeper's breath was deeply significant in Norse belief, where the soul and the breath were seen as one and the same. To have your breath stolen by the Mara was, quite literally, to have your spirit held hostage by a shadow. In the younger folklore of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Mara was sometimes depicted as a beautiful but spiteful woman, while other accounts described a twisted, ancient hag with fingers as long and thin as willow branches. She possessed the uncanny ability to change her shape, manifesting as a cat, a dog, or even a swarm of insects to gain entry into a home. A keyhole or a small crack in a doorframe was all the invitation she required. Once inside, she would drift toward the bed, her movements silent as she prepared to settle her weight. The sleeper might feel a slight pressure at the foot of the mattress first, a gentle sinking of the wool and straw, before the weight began its slow, deliberate climb toward the heart. It was a physical invasion that felt intensely personal, as if the shadow knew exactly where the human spirit was most fragile. When the morning finally came, and the Mara retreated back into the shadows of the forest, she often left behind physical evidence of her visit. In Sweden, people spoke of the märpines, trees that grew twisted and stunted on the rocky coasts, believed to have been ridden and deformed by the spirit during her nocturnal travels. For the humans who survived her visit, the mark was often found in their hair. Waking up with a cluster of impossible knots or tangles was a sign of the mare braid, a token left by the entity after a night of torment. These tangles were more than just a nuisance. They were a lingering reminder that while the sun had risen, the weight of the Mara was never far away. The breath of the night had cooled, but the memory of the pressure remained, etched into the very strands of their hair and the bark of the trees, waiting for the sun to dip once more below the horizon. As the 18th century began to wane, the world was supposedly entering a time of light and reason. Scholars and scientists believed they could map every corner of the human mind, explaining away the monsters of the past with logic and medicine. Yet, in the year 1781, a Swiss-born artist named Henry Fuseli was laboring in a quiet London studio, preparing to show the world that the shadows were far from conquered. He stood before a large canvas, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil thick in the air. On the reverse side of this very fabric, he had painted a portrait of a woman he loved but could never have, a woman named Anna Landolt. It was as if his unrequited longing and the bitterness of rejection were the very primer for the masterpiece that was about to emerge. He was not interested in the moralizing, clean stories of his peers. He wanted to capture the texture of a scream that could not be uttered, the weight of a night that refused to end. The painting, which he simply titled The Nightmare, is a study in profound vulnerability. At its center, a woman lies across a bed, her body draped in a way that suggests a total loss of control. Her head hangs off the edge of the mattress, exposing the long, pale curve of her neck. Her arms are flung downward, limp and useless, as if the bones themselves had turned to water. She is dressed in a gown of brilliant white, a shard of uncorrupted silver that stands in startling contrast to the murky, suffocating shadows that press in from the edges of the frame. This is a visual manifestation of what we now understand as atonia. It is the physiological prison where the mind wakes, but the body remains tethered to the floor of a dream. Fuseli captured the exact moment when the sleeper realizes they are helpless, a state where the softest pillow can feel like a stone and the familiar sheets become a shroud. But the true terror of the canvas sits squarely upon her chest. There, squatting with a malicious and heavy presence, is the incubus. It is a dark, ape-like creature with pointed ears and a gaze that does not look at the woman, but rather directly at us, the viewers. It is as if the demon is acknowledging our presence, inviting us to witness the crushing weight it exerts on its victim. In folklore, this was the Mara, the spirit that came to steal the breath from the lungs and the strength from the heart. Fuseli's brushwork gives the creature a physical density that is almost palpable. You can almost feel the air being squeezed out of the woman's lungs as the small, hideous monster settles its weight. It is the personification of that singular, terrifying sensation reported by sleep paralysis sufferers for thousands of years. The feeling of a leaden pressure, a malevolent force that occupies the very center of one's being, making every shallow breath an act of desperate rebellion. Behind the bed, emerging from the deep crimson of the velvet curtains, is the head of a horse. This is the nightmare, a spectral beast with eyes that are wide, white, and entirely devoid of pupils. They look like glowing orbs of milk, blind to the physical world, but staring intently into the internal landscape of the sleeper's mind. The horse's nostrils are flared as if it is scenting the fear in the room, its presence adding a layer of surreal, animalistic dread to the scene. Some art historians believe this was a clever play on words, a visual pun on the term nightmare, but its effect is far from humorous. The horse represents the vehicle of the journey into the underworld, the silent witness to the woman's private torment. The way its head pokes through the heavy fabric suggests that the boundary between the physical room and the realm of monsters is paper-thin, easily breached by the simple act of closing one's eyes. When the painting was first exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1782, it caused a genuine sensation. The crowds in London were used to portraits of noblemen and scenes from the Bible, but here was something entirely different. They were shocked and titillated by its raw, psychological intensity. Critics reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination, calling it a nightmare in the chest of British art. It was a breakthrough success for Fuseli, and the image spread rapidly through low-priced engravings, finding its way into the homes and minds of the public. People who had experienced these terrifying nocturnal visitations finally had a name and a face for their fear. They could point to the canvas and say there, "That is what happens to me when the clock strikes 3. It moved the conversation of sleep terrors out of the dark forests of folklore and into the analytical light of the city, even as it celebrated the irrationality of the human spirit. The legacy of the painting stretched far beyond the gallery walls. It is said that Mary Shelley was inspired by its haunting imagery when she wrote Frankenstein, and even Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, mused upon its meaning. Centuries later, Sigmund Freud would keep a reproduction of this very painting on the wall of his apartment in Vienna. He saw in it the first true map of the unconscious, a recognition that our dreams are not just random flickers of the mind, but a deep well of desires, fears, and biological realities. Fuseli's work became the master image of horror, a bridge between the ancient world of demons and the modern world of psychology. Even as we moved into the 19th and 20th centuries, the image remained, a persistent reminder that no matter how much we learn about the brain, the feeling of a heavy shadow sitting on our chest remains one of the most primal experiences of being alive. The canvas continues to stare back at us, reflecting the timeless terror of the night. In the quiet of a 19th century evening, the world outside the physician's window would have been a tapestry of deep blues and heavy silvers. Imagine a room filled with the scent of dried lavender and old leather, where a single candle flickers against the encroaching dark. Here, a doctor sits at a heavy mahogany desk, his fingers stained with the dark residue of India ink. He is not looking at a ghost story, though the accounts before him are more terrifying than any fiction. He is poring over the pages of a medical journal, perhaps the writings of Robert Macnish from 1830, or the observations of John Waller from 1816. These men were the pioneers of the rational mind, trying to cast the light of science into the abyss of the human night. They were grappling with a condition they called the nightmare, a word they often wrote with a heavy hyphen, as if to separate the darkness of the evening from the weight of the experience itself. To them, it was not a phantom, but a physiological puzzle. As the doctor turns the thick, cream-colored pages, the paper makes a soft, dry, rasping sound, like a leaf skittering across a cold stone floor. He reads of patients who describe a weight so immense that it feels as though a leaden statue has been placed upon their ribcage. In these journals, the language of the supernatural begins to bleed into the language of the clinic. The doctor notes how the heart thrashes like a trapped bird against the chest wall, while the limbs remain as cold and immobile as marble. He writes of the suffocating sensation, a terrifying conviction that the very air in the room has turned to water. In his notes, there is a visible struggle. He wants to believe in the order of the body, in the predictable flow of blood and the steady rhythm of breath, yet the testimonies of his patients are filled with things that should not exist. They speak of shadow men and grinning hags, of a presence that watches from the corner of the eye with a malice that no fever could explain. The physician considers the prevailing theories of his time, searching for a physical anchor for this spectral torment. One theory, popular in the early 19th century, suggested that the nightmare was caused by a congestion of blood in the brain. He imagines the vessels swelling, a slow tide of crimson pressure that pins the consciousness to the bed. Others, following the ancient beliefs of the Persians or the Greeks, suggested that vapors from a heavy meal were rising from the stomach to the head, clouding the senses like a thick fog rolling in from the harbor. He looks at his patient, a young woman who has not slept in 4 days for fear of the return of the visitor, and he wonders if a simple change in diet or a cooling cloth to the forehead could truly banish a demon. He records the symptoms with clinical detachment, yet his hand trembles slightly as he writes the word Ephialtes, the ancient Greek name for the leaper who crushes the breath from the sleeping. There is a tragic edge to these medical journals, for where science failed to find an answer, it often found a scapegoat. The doctor weighs the possibility of madness. In the 1800s, the line between a physical ailment and a broken mind was a thin, jagged wire. If a patient insisted that a creature was sitting on their chest, and the doctor could find no physical bruise, the diagnosis often shifted toward the asylum. He writes of the fear that this paralysis is a precursor to something far worse, perhaps a stroke or a permanent descent into delirium. He describes the treatment of bloodletting, the sharp prick of the lancet, and the slow, rhythmic drip of life into a porcelain bowl. It was a desperate attempt to relieve the supposed pressure in the brain, a way to drain the nightmare out of the body through the veins. But as the patient grows weaker and paler, the shadows in the room only seem to grow longer and more defined. The physician's struggle was one of transition. He was standing on the bridge between the age of folklore and the age of the machine. He begins to speculate, much like John Waller did in 1816, that perhaps the brain is not a single unit but a collection of parts. He wonders if it is possible for the eyes to be awake, for the mind to be conscious of the ticking clock and the moonlight on the floor, while the rest of the body remains locked in the heavy slumber of the grave. This was a revolutionary thought, a glimpse into the mechanics of the nervous system that would not be fully understood for another century. He describes it as a partial waking, a glitch in the transition from the world of dreams to the world of reality. Yet even with this rational spark, he cannot explain why every patient sees the same darkness, why the mind, when left in this half-lit state, chooses to manifest a monster. The journals fall silent on many of the outcomes, but we can imagine the physician blowing out his candle as the first gray light of dawn touches the window pane. He has spent the night fighting a battle that cannot be won with leeches or tonics. He is left with the haunting realization that for all his medical training, the human mind remains a vast, uncharted wilderness. He records one final observation, noting that the nightmare seems most prevalent when a person lies upon their back, their throat exposed to the air of the room. He suggests that perhaps the position of the body invites the heaviness, a simple physical vulnerability that the imagination fills with terror. It is a comforting thought for him, a way to make the world small and manageable again. He closes the book, the heavy leather cover snapping shut with a finality that echoes through the quiet house, leaving the demon of the journals to wait in the darkness of the next night. This 19th century struggle reminds us that the fear of the unknown is a universal thread. The doctors of the past were not so different from us, trying to find a name for the thing that goes bump in the night, trying to turn a ghost into a diagnosis. As we look back through the ink-stained pages of history, we see a mirror of our own search for certainty. The physician might have replaced the word demon with congestion or respiratory failure, but the terror in the patient's eyes remained the same. It is a slow, enduring mystery, one that bridges the gap between the medical ward and the haunted bedroom. We are left to wonder if the science of today has truly banished the shadows, or if we have simply found more sophisticated names for the visitors that wait at the edge of our sleep, watching us from the corner of the room while we are unable to move. In the heart of Chicago, in the year 1953, the thick fog of ancient folklore began to lift, slowly replaced by the clinical hum of the modern laboratory. Imagine a basement room at the University of Chicago, where the air is cool and carries the faint, metallic scent of ozone and aging paper. The walls are lined with heavy, metal-cased machines, oscillographs that hum a low, constant note, a sound that vibrates through the floorboards and settles deep in your chest. Here, the Old Hag was no longer a demon to be exorcised by prayer, but a subject to be measured by the steady movement of ink on a rolling paper tape. A young graduate student named Eugene Asarinsky sat in the dim light, his eyes tracing the frantic motion of a needle. He was watching his son sleep, but the needles were telling a story that defied everything science believed. The machines of that era were mechanical beasts, and their operation was a symphony of small, deliberate noises. Each scratch of the pen was a physical record of a heartbeat, a breath, or a tiny twitch of a muscle. As the paper unspooled, inches turning into feet and feet into miles of ink-stained lines, it revealed a hidden rhythm that had existed since the dawn of humanity. Asarinsky and his mentor, Nathaniel Clateman, noticed that several times a night, the sleeping brain would ignite with a fierce, internal activity. It was a chaotic, electric dance of neurons. The eyes behind closed lids began to dart frantically, as if watching an invisible film projected on the inside of the skull. This was the moment of the dream, the peak of the internal theater where the mind is most creative. But as the mind surged, the body became like stone. This was the great biological contradiction, the first piece of the puzzle that would eventually explain why a person could wake up and find themselves unable to move a single finger. This state became known as paradoxical sleep. It is a paradox because the brain waves look almost identical to those of a person who is wide awake and alert. The neurons are firing, the processing centers are humming, and the imagination is vivid and alive. Yet the physical self is in a state of total, profound collapse. In the 1950s, this discovery shifted the narrative from the supernatural to the physiological, showing that sleep was not a passive slide into darkness, but a complex, multi-stage journey. During this phase, the brain creates a deliberate disconnection between the command center and the machinery of the muscles, an evolutionary gift designed to keep us safe while we dream. Deep within the brainstem, a chemical switch is thrown. We now know that neurotransmitters like gamma-minobutyric acid and glycine act as the silent wardens of our mobility. Imagine these chemicals as a soft, invisible blanket being laid over the motor neurons of the spinal cord. They effectively mute the signals that the brain sends out. When the dreaming mind screams to run, the legs remain still because the chemical gates are closed. This is muscle atonia. It is a state of grace that allows us to dream of flying without ever leaving the safety of our sheets. In the quiet of the lab, as the ink pens continued their tireless scratching, the researchers were unknowingly mapping the mechanism of the demon's weight. They were seeing the physical proof of the paralysis that has haunted humanity for thousands of years, stripped of its ancient, terrifying masks. The glitch occurs when the transition between these states becomes unsynchronized. Imagine a bridge that is supposed to lower just as a train arrives, but instead, it remains stuck in the air. This is the essence of the REM paradox during an episode of sleep paralysis. The mind wakes up, the consciousness returns to the room, the eyes open, and the person sees their familiar surroundings, but the chemical switch for the muscles has not yet been flipped back to the on position. The GABA and glycine are still performing their duty, holding the body in that protective, leaden stillness. To the person lying in the dark, it feels like being buried alive in one's own skin. Every limb feels as though it has been replaced by cold iron. You try to call out for help, but the vocal cords are part of the silent machinery, locked away behind the chemical barrier. Science began to strip away the leather wings of the demon, replacing them with the elegant reality of neural inhibition. Yet, knowing the chemistry does little to ease the fear. The brain, finding itself awake but trapped, begins to search for a reason, often crafting a shadow in the corner to justify its own frozen terror. It is here, in the gap between the chemicals and the consciousness, where the demon still breathes, a ghost in our complex biological machine. The bridge we spoke of is not always empty. Sometimes, as you stand in that fragile space between worlds, you are not the only one there. You are lying in your bed, the familiar scent of cotton and laundry detergent grounding you, but the air in the room has begun to change. It feels thicker now, as if the oxygen is being replaced by a heavy, invisible static. The shadows in the corner of your ceiling, which usually dance with the passing headlights of a car outside, have suddenly stopped moving. They have pooled together, forming a mass that is darker than the night surrounding it. This is the moment when the silhouette appears in the doorway. It is a figure so distinct, so hauntingly consistent across every continent on this earth, that it has earned a name that whispers through the collective unconscious of humanity. They call him the Hat Man. Imagine the texture of a shadow that has weight. He stands at least 6 feet tall, though many claim he towers toward 8 or even 10, his head nearly brushing the crown of the door frame. He wears a wide-brimmed hat, often described as a fedora or a gaucho hat, with a brim so sharp it seems to cut through the very dimness of the room. Beneath the hat, there is no face. There are no eyes to meet yours, no mouth to speak a greeting, and yet you feel the crushing weight of his gaze. It is a focused, intentional stare that makes the skin on your arms crawl. He is draped in a long, heavy trench coat, or perhaps a cape that falls all the way to his invisible feet, a garment made of ink and old wool that seems to absorb all the light in the house. He does not breathe. He does not move. He simply occupies the space, a vertical void in the middle of your life. What makes this entity so unsettling is not just his appearance, but his reach. From the small villages in the United Kingdom to the high-rise apartments of Tokyo, and from the deep forests of Canada to the sun-drenched plains of Africa, the description remains identical. In Brazil, they might speak of the Pisadera who sits upon the chest, and in Newfoundland, they fear the Old Hag. In Turkey, the Carabassan stalks the weary. But the Hat Man is a modern, unified phenomenon that transcends these ancient labels. People who have never heard of him, who have never browsed a forum or seen a horror film, wake up to find the same tall, hatted figure watching them from the corner. It is as if he is a passenger on the same train we all take into the night, waiting for the moments when the tracks fail, and the passengers are left stranded in the dark. The atmosphere surrounding him is a sensory vacuum. When he is present, the normal sounds of the night, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the rhythm of your own heart, fall away into a terrifying silence. It is not the peaceful silence of a library, but a ringing, pressurized void, like the feeling in your ears when you dive too deep into cold water. Some witnesses report a faint smell of ozone or the scent of wet stone, as if the figure has just stepped out of a storm that exists only in the mind. There is a coldness that radiates from the doorway, a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the air and everything to do with the freezing of the soul. You want to scream, to ask him why he is there, but your throat is a desert and your tongue is made of lead. You are a prisoner in your own skin, and he is the silent warden. Scientists tell us that this is a trick of the brain, a result of the hypervigilance state triggered by the midbrain when it senses a threat it cannot identify. They argue that our ancestors survived because they saw a predator in every bush, and that the Hat Man is simply a false positive, a biological error where the brain creates a person-shaped explanation for the terror it feels. But if he is just an error, why is the error so specific? Why the hat? Why the coat? Why the long, patient observation from the threshold? There is a theory that he is an archetype, a shadow cast by the human ego into the theater of the bedroom. Or perhaps he is exactly what he appears to be, a traveler from a place where the sun never rises, who has found a way to slip through the gaps in our neurochemistry. He does not need to attack. The mere fact of his existence is enough to shatter the peace of 1,000 nights. As you lie there, unable to even blink, you might see him tilt his head ever so slightly. It is a slow, agonizingly deliberate movement, as if he is curious about the fear he is harvesting. He might take a single step forward, the fabric of his shadow coat rippling like oil on water. There is no sound of a footfall, no creak of the floorboards, yet you feel the shift in the room's gravity. He is leaning into your world, testing the boundary. Some say he carries a gold pocket watch, checking the seconds as they stretch into infinities, waiting for the exact moment when the bridge finally lowers and you are allowed to wake. When that moment comes, and the paralysis breaks with a sudden, gasping breath, the doorway is empty. The hat, the coat, and the void are gone, leaving behind only the frantic thumping of your heart and the lingering, cold certainty that he was truly there, and that he knows the way back. The silence of the room, once a comfort, begins to warp. It is not the absence of sound that strikes you now, but the presence of a new, synthetic layer over the world. It begins as a low-frequency hum, the kind you might hear from a distant electrical transformer on a humid night. It vibrates through the base of your skull, a heavy and insistent thrumming that makes your teeth feel as though they are vibrating in their sockets. You try to swallow, to clear the pressure in your ears, but your throat is a pillar of salt. The hum deepens, expanding until it fills every corner of the ceiling. It is the sound of the static between two radio stations, a white noise that masks the familiar creaks of your house, turning your sanctuary into a hollow chamber of white, rushing wind. Within that static, there is a texture, a graininess that feels like sand being poured slowly over a drum. You might recognize it as the sound of your own blood rushing through the carotid arteries, a rhythmic whooshing that usually stays hidden in the background of your consciousness. But here, in the depths of the paralysis, it is amplified 1,000 times. It becomes a roar. Some describe it as the sound of a large desk fan spinning at an impossible speed right next to their ear, the blades cutting through the air with a relentless, mechanical efficiency. It is a zapping, crackling energy that seems to dance along the edge of your perception. You are witnessing the raw electricity of your own nervous system, firing in the dark, desperate to bridge the gap between the dreaming mind and the frozen body. Then the static begins to take shape. It is no longer just noise, it is intention. A sound emerges from the rushing wind, a sound so specific and so personal that it feels like a physical touch. It is your name. It is not shouted, nor is it sung. It is whispered with a breathy, dry quality, as if the air itself has learned how to speak. The syllable of your name hangs in the stagnant air, vibrating with a familiarity that is deeply unsettling. You wonder how a shadow, a thing made of absence, could know what to call you. The whisper seems to come from directly behind your head, or perhaps from the very center of your pillow. It is a soft, intimate violation of your privacy, a reminder that whatever is in the room with you has been watching you for a very long time. Following the whisper comes the weight of movement. You hear the floorboards complain, a slow and deliberate groan that travels from the doorway toward the side of your bed. These are not the random house noises of a settling foundation. These are footsteps. They are heavy, rhythmic, and purposeful. Each thud carries a wet, dragging quality as if something is pulling a heavy weight across the carpet. You count them in your mind. 1, 2, 3. They stop for a moment, and the silence that follows is even louder than the noise. You can hear the fabric of your curtains rustling, though there is no breeze. You can hear the sound of lungs that are not your own, taking in air with a ragged, whistling effort. The intruder is no longer a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. Sometimes the auditory landscape takes a more violent turn. This is the phenomenon where the static does not just hum, it explodes. Without warning, a sound like a gunshot or a thunderclap echoes through the internal architecture of your brain. It is an electrical storm within the skull, a sudden discharge of neurons that makes you feel as though your very ears might shatter. Yet, the room remains still. The dust motes continue to dance in the moonlight, unaffected by the cataclysm occurring inside you. This exploding head syndrome is the peak of the brain's confusion, a desperate flare sent up by a mind that is trapped in the transition of a 90-minute sleep cycle. It is the sound of the barrier between worlds cracking open, allowing the whispers of the static to flood into your waking reality with a deafening, terrifying roar. All of this, the buzzing, the name, the footsteps, is the result of a hypervigilant midbrain. In this state of atonia, your brain has detected a threat that it cannot escape, so it begins to manifest the details of that threat in the air around you. It creates the sound of an intruder to justify the fear you feel. As you lie there, the static begins to smooth out into a single, low growl. The footsteps have reached the edge of your bed. The air feels thick, charged with the ozone of a coming storm. The static is no longer a noise, it is a herald. And as the sound of your own name is whispered one final time, you realize that the whispers were only the beginning. The hypervigilance of the midbrain is a biological fire that burns in the dark. But to understand it fully, we must step out of the subjective fog and into the cool, unforgiving light of the laboratory. We find ourselves now in a place some researchers call the sterile observatory. It is a room stripped of comfort, designed to strip away the myths of the night hag and replace them with the cold precision of an electroencephalograph. Here, the air carries the faint, medicinal scent of rubbing alcohol and the metallic tang of conductive paste. The walls are an off-white that seems to absorb sound, creating a silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight against your eardrums. In the center of this vacuum lies a bed, narrow and firm, draped in thin linens that have been bleached until they are as pale as a winter moon. This is the stage where the shadow play is measured, where the demon is invited out of the subconscious and into the digital record. We are no longer alone in a bedroom. We are under the watchful gaze of a dozen electronic eyes, waiting for the bridge between worlds to collapse. A participant lies still on the mattress, their skin mapped with small, silver discs. These electrodes are glued to the scalp, the temples, and the chin with a thick, white adhesive that feels cool and tacky as it sets. Each wire is a colorful thread, red, blue, yellow, snaking away from the body and gathering into a thick bundle that plugs into a wall-mounted interface. In the adjacent room, separated by a thick pane of soundproof glass, the researchers sit in the dim glow of their monitors. They are modern cartographers of the mind, charting the rise and fall of sleep cycles like waves against a shore. They are not looking for spirits. They are looking for a specific, elusive frequency. They are waiting for the moment when the brain decides to wake up, but forgets to tell the rest of the body. To find this moment, they must carefully manipulate the very nature of rest. They use a technique known as sleep interruption, a method refined since the early 1990s. They allow the participant to drift into the shallow waters of sleep, only to pull them back to the surface after exactly 40 minutes of non-rapid eye movement. It is a delicate, rhythmic teasing of the consciousness, designed to fracture the normal progression of the night. As the hours crawl toward 3 in the morning, the atmosphere in the sterile observatory shifts. The participant is exhausted, their natural sleep architecture shattered by the repeated awakenings. This exhaustion is the key. It creates a shortcut in the brain, a direct path that bypasses the usual stages of descent and plunges the mind straight into the deep, vivid world of dreaming. On the monitors in the observation room, the scrolling lines begin to change. We see the jagged, irregular scribbles of wakefulness begin to smooth out into the rhythmic, rolling hills of theta waves. This is the language of the dream. But then something strange happens, a glitch in the matrix of sleep. Suddenly, a burst of alpha activity appears, flickering across the screen like a ghost in the machine. Alpha waves are the signature of a relaxed, waking mind. To see them dancing alongside the theta waves of a deep dream is to witness a biological paradox. It is a state of dissociation, where the brain is simultaneously convinced it is awake and certain that it is still in the depths of a rapid eye movement cycle. It is the exact moment the laboratory becomes haunted by the presence of a conscious mind trapped in a sleeping cage. The researchers lean closer to the screens. They are watching the electromyogram, the line that measures the electrical activity of the muscles. In a normal waking person, this line is a constant, vibrant hum of micro-movements. But here, it has gone flat. It is a horizontal void, signifying that the body is in a state of total atonia. The glycine and gamma-aminobutyric acid have done their work too well, severing the connection between the motor cortex and the limbs. The participant is now a prisoner within their own skin. They are aware of the room, aware of the cold air and the hum of the computers, yet they cannot lift a finger. They cannot even part their lips to call out. But there is one part of the body that remains free: the eyes. Because the muscles that control eye movement are wired differently, they remain under the participant's command. Years ago, researchers taught subjects a code, a way to speak from the silence. If they found themselves paralyzed, they were to move their eyes in a specific pattern: left, right, left, right. It is a desperate, silent signal flare sent from a drowning man, and as the researchers see those rapid shifts on the monitor, they know that the experiment has been successful. The demon has arrived. In this clinical silence, the participant is experiencing a nightmare that feels more real than the white walls around them. Because the brain is in that dissociated state, it is desperately trying to make sense of why the body will not move. It interprets the heavy atonia as a physical weight, and it projects a reason for that weight into the room. A shadow is born from the corner of the eye, a figure that the logic of the laboratory cannot banish. The heart rate on the monitor begins to climb, ticking up from 60 beats per minute to 80, then 90. The breathing becomes shallow and irregular, not because of a lack of oxygen, but because the intercostal muscles are still partially paralyzed, making every breath feel like a struggle against a crushing force. To the scientists, these are merely data points on a graph: elevated heart rate, rapid eye movement, muscle atonia. But to the person on the bed, it is a life-or-death struggle with an ancient intruder. The gap between the clinical and the cataclysmic is only a few millimeters of electrode wire. We are watching the very machinery of terror being mapped in real time, seeing how a simple timing error in the brainstem can summon a monster into a room full of scientists. The episode lasts for only 2 minutes, though for the subject, it feels like an eternity in a timeless void. Eventually, the chemicals at the base of the brain begin to dissipate. The alpha waves take over, the theta waves retreat, and with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, the participant regains control of their limbs. The flat line of the muscle monitor erupts into a frantic, jagged peak as they sit up, their hands shaking as they reach for the electrodes. The researchers enter the room, their voices soft and low as they begin the debriefing. They ask about the sensations, about the presence, and about the fear. They record the accounts with the same dispassionate detail they used for the brainwaves. They are looking for the common threads, the feeling of being watched, the pressure on the chest, the buzzing sound. What they find is that even in this sterile environment, stripped of all folklore and superstition, the hallucinations remain remarkably consistent across different cultures and backgrounds. The brain, when pushed into this specific corner of the night, always tells the same story. It is a story of an intruder, a shadow, and a weight. As we leave the observatory, we realize that the laboratory hasn't actually explained away the demon. It has only confirmed its existence as a universal inhabitant of the human architecture, waiting for the right frequency to emerge from the shadows once again. The stillness of the bedroom in the middle of the night is rarely absolute. There is the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional groan of the house settling into its foundation, and the distant, rhythmic shushing of the wind through the oak trees outside. But for the person trapped in the grip of the shadow, these sounds become distorted, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. The air itself seems to gain a physical weight, pressing down with the density of cold, wet wool. In our investigation into this phenomena, we have reached a turning point. We are no longer looking at the terror as an external force, but rather as a biological puzzle waiting to be solved. Long-term sufferers, those who have lived through these nocturnal visitations hundreds of times, describe a shift in consciousness that happens once the initial panic subsides. It is a transition from the role of a helpless victim to that of a detached observer, a scientist studying the interior of their own fractured psyche. The first and most vital technique used to dismantle the paralysis is often called the microscopic focus. When the body is locked in atonia, the large muscle groups of the chest, the legs, and the arms are under a heavy chemical seal, but the very edges of our physical being remain slightly more accessible. Sufferers are taught to pull their mental spotlight away from the looming figure at the foot of the bed and direct it entirely toward the very tip of a single index finger or the smallest toe on the left foot. You must imagine the electrical impulse traveling down from the motor cortex, navigating the long, winding pathways of the spine, and arriving at that tiny, solitary tendon. It is a slow, agonizingly quiet battle of will. You do not try to sit up. You do not try to shout. Instead, you focus on a single, infinitesimal twitch. You feel the texture of the cotton sheet beneath your nail, the slight coolness of the air on that one patch of skin, and you wait. You wait for the microscopic spark that breaks the dam. While the limbs remain frozen, there is one bridge that remains open between the conscious mind and the autonomic system: the breath. The sensation of a heavy weight on the chest is often a misinterpretation by the brain, a reaction to the shallow, restricted breathing that occurs during the rapid eye movement phase of sleep. To master the mind is to master the diaphragm. Sufferers find that by consciously taking a long, slow, purposeful breath, they can send a signal of safety to the amygdala, the primitive part of the brain that is currently screaming in terror. You feel the lungs expand against the invisible pressure, a slow rise and fall that contradicts the hallucination of a physical intruder. With each cycle of breath, you are reclaiming territory. You are telling the nervous system that the threat is an illusion born of a biological glitch. This rhythmic breathing acts as an anchor, preventing the mind from drifting further into the dark waters of a waking nightmare, and instead pulling it back toward the shores of true wakefulness. For some, however, the goal is not to wake up, but to go deeper. This is where the practice of lucid dreaming enters our investigation. Experienced dreamers view sleep paralysis not as a cage, but as a launch pad, a rare state of consciousness where the veil between the waking world and the dream world is at its thinnest. This is known as the wake-induced lucid dream technique. Rather than fighting the paralysis, the practitioner leans into it. They acknowledge the vibration, the strange electrical buzzing that often accompanies the state, and they begin to visualize a new reality. They might imagine themselves standing in a sun-drenched field or walking through a familiar childhood home. By maintaining a thread of awareness while the body remains asleep, they can transform the shadow at the bedside into something entirely different. The demon is not banished, it is repurposed. It becomes a doorway, a threshold that the dreamer steps through with a sense of profound agency. They are no longer the one being watched, they are the architect of the vision. The moment of release, when it finally comes, is often described as a physical snap or a sudden melting away of tension. As that single finger finally twitches, or as the breathing reaches a certain steady frequency, the chemical block in the brainstem dissolves. The sensation is like a sudden rush of warmth returning to a limb that has fallen asleep. The heavy pressure on the chest vanishes as if the shadow had never been there at all. The room returns to its natural dimensions. The pile of clothes on the chair is once again just fabric and shadow, not a crouching entity. The silence is no longer dense, it is light and hollow. Sufferers often lie still for several minutes after the release, feeling the frantic beating of their heart slow down to a peaceful tempo. They have navigated the void and returned to the shore of the physical self, carrying with them the quiet triumph of having looked into the eyes of their own fear and found nothing but a trick of the light. Mastering the mind in the face of such profound biological terror requires a deep, almost philosophical patience. It is an understanding that the monsters we meet in the darkness are often just the brain's way of narrating its own confusion. By stripping away the supernatural layers and looking at the raw mechanics of the experience, the power of the demon begins to fade. It is no longer an ancient predator, but a fascinating quirk of human evolution, a temporary misalignment between the soul and the vessel. As you drift back toward a more restful sleep, you carry this knowledge like a shield. The next time the shadows lengthen and the air grows heavy, you will not panic. You will simply remember the breath, the finger, and the door. You are the master of this internal landscape, and the darkness only has as much room as you choose to give it. The investigate continues, but for now, there is only the soft, steady rhythm of the night and the peaceful realization that you are, as you have always been, entirely safe. The shadows are receding now, pulled back by the slow and inevitable tide of the morning. You can see the pale, pearlescent light beginning to trace the edges of the window frame, turning the once threatening shapes of the night back into the familiar, mundane objects of your room. That tall, dark figure in the corner, it is only the heavy winter coat you draped over the chair before the sun went down. The whispering you heard, it was only the wind brushing against the glass. We have spent so much time in the deep, heavy silence of the night, exploring the entities that seem to dwell there, but now we must find our way back to the shore. This final step in our journey is about reconciliation. It is about building a bridge between the ancient, primal fears that have haunted our ancestors for thousands of years, and the calm, orderly explanations that modern science offers us today. As the dawn embraces the world, we find that the monster is not a creature of the void, but a mirror of our own complex biology. When we look at this phenomenon through the lens of a microscope, the terror transforms into a remarkable biological sequence. Scientists call this state a parasomnia, a simple glitch in the delicate transition between the waking world and the realm of dreams. During the stage of sleep known as rapid eye movement, or REM, your brain performs a beautiful protective act. It releases two neurotransmitters called GABA and glycine. These chemicals act like soft, velvet keys, turning the lock on your motor neurons and inducing a state of atonia. This paralysis is not an attack, it is a shield. It ensures that while you are flying through the clouds or running through forests in your mind, your physical body remains safe and still in your bed. When you experience sleep paralysis, you are simply witnessing this protective mechanism while your consciousness is prematurely awake. You are caught in the doorway, seeing the machinery of sleep while you still have the eyes of the waking. Across the vast tapestry of human history, every culture has tried to name this moment of being caught between worlds. In the rugged, salt-sprayed coastal towns of Newfoundland, they spoke of the Old Hag who would ride the breath out of her victims. In the quiet, meditative spaces of Japan, it was known as kanashibari, a word rooted in the idea of being bound by invisible metal chains. In Brazil, they whispered of the pisadera, a withered crone with long fingernails who would lurk upon the rooftops, waiting to step upon the chests of those who slept with a full stomach. In Mexico, the experience is described as the spirit of a dead person climbing upon the sleeper. These names were the only tools our ancestors had to describe a feeling of profound helplessness. They turned a chemical misfire into a ghost story to make the fear more tangible, more understandable. They gave the shadow a face so they would know where to look when the night became too heavy to bear. We can look back to the year 1664, when a Dutch physician first recorded a formal clinical history of a woman who felt the weight of a great dog or a devil sitting upon her. We can look to the year 1781, when the artist Henry Fuseli painted his famous work, The Nightmare, showing a woman draped in white while a small, grotesque creature sits upon her torso. These are not records of the supernatural, but records of the human mind trying to process a biological mystery. Today, we know that these hallucinations are the result of an overactive amygdala, the part of the brain that scans for threats. When the body is paralyzed but the mind is alert, the amygdala enters a state of high alarm. It creates a threat where there is none, pulling images from your deepest memories and weaving them into the room around you. The demon you see is simply your brain's way of asking why you cannot move. Peace comes from understanding that you are in control. If you ever find yourself back in that frozen state, remember that the smallest movement can break the spell. Focus on the very tip of your index finger or the smallest toe on your left foot. Try to wiggle it, just a fraction of an inch. That tiny signal from your brain to your extremity is often enough to tell the rest of your nervous system that it is time to wake up. Practice good sleep hygiene by resting on your side rather than your back, as the supine position is a known trigger for these episodes. Reduce the clutter of your mind before you drift off, and let go of the stressors that keep your brain in a state of hypervigilance. You are the master of your own internal landscape. The demons have no power here because they were never truly there to begin with. They were only echoes, flickering in the hall between two rooms. As the sun rises higher, the last of the mysteries dissolve into the light of day. We have walked through the history, the folklore, and the biology of the night's most enduring terrors, and we have found that there is nothing to fear but the complexity of our own beautiful minds. You have the knowledge now to sleep without worry, knowing that your body is simply looking after you, even in its most silent moments. The air in your room is cool and still, and your bed is a sanctuary of safety and rest. There are no hags, no shadows, and no weights upon your chest, only the gentle rhythm of your heart and the promise of deep, restorative slumber. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.